And I love the story. So my aunt, my godmother, and I called her my aunt. She was like my grandmother. Like I mean, she was just that close. So she lived in a duplex. She lived in one half of a duplex. My mom lived in the other half with her parents. She babysat my mom. And then obviously when my brother and I were born, she was our godmother. So she was like a grandmother to me. She was never married. She just the sweetest woman. So she bought the car brand new in 1960. Couldn't tell you exactly when, but she bought it brand new in 1960. We think it was from a dealership called Fox Motors. We think it was an unlicensed Volkswagen dealership. This guy bought him and brought him over from Germany, and I think that's why it was a Euro Beetle. She was literally a little old lady who drove it to church on Sunday. When I was growing up, we lived 15 minutes away, like 7 miles, right? So we saw her all the time. She babysat me, Christmases, Thanksgivings, birthdays, saw her all the time. I mean, she always went over the top. And when I turned 16, she's like, her name was Aunt Betty. And she's like, hey, do you want my Volkswagen Beetle? I'm like, Aunt Betty, what Volkswagen Beetle? I mean, I've known this woman for 16 years. I've never seen and or heard of this car in my entire life. Her partner always drove her, so I always saw her car, right? And it was always a Lincoln Mark 7 or a Mark 8 or so, like this big boat. She had this car and it was garage kept, and I never even knew it existed. So this thing was in Hazelton, Pennsylvania, so the Northeast. You're talking snow, salt, all that crap on the roads. Kept it in the garage, and I didn't know it existed. And of course I said, yeah. So she gave me the car. And when I got my driver's license at 17, so at the time we had moved down from Pennsylvania, New Jersey. So we drove up and we got the car and I drove it home. That's how I got it. She gave it to me and I didn't even know she had it. And like I said, it grew up in the snow and the salt and all that. And I mean, you guys saw what minimum amount of rust it had on. A little bit on the rear shock towers, a little bit in the rear luggage, and the typical pinhole from the spare tire. Hands were solid. The heater channels were solid. And I got it, like I said, it was 80. I had it my senior year of high school, and then it had 28,000 miles on it. And so I got it as a teenager. I drove it. And having it back now after, I mean, just the last 3 weeks since I've had it from Airkooled, I think back and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe some of the stupid things I did with this car. I drove that car down the New Jersey Turnpike to Great Adventure from Flemington. I drove it for about a year and a half. We got up to about 43,000 miles on it. Started popping out of first and reverse. It was a blessing in disguise, because if that hadn't happened, I would have driven that car into the ground, gotten rid of it, and moved on. It started popping out of first and reverse, and there was no internet at the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There wasn't the community. Dad knew of a couple local Volkswagen shops, and he's like, well, we could, drop the transaxle out. We could re-weld the front mount. We could put a bus transmission in it. We're like, oh, that sounds like a hack job, but that's what they did. So I only drove it for about 18 months, and then it died. And then we got the idea of, okay, well, we'll drop the engine, we'll drop the transaxle, we'll have the transaxle rebuilt. We did that, and then I went off to college. And it sat in my dad's garage for 10 or 15 years. Yeah, he's like, do you want to get rid of this car? I'm like, no, I still want it. No, I still want it now. I still want it. Eventually, he moved it out to a little shed right out by the garage. And it sat there. And whenever he'd have the shed open, because he's cutting the grass or something, people would pull up all the time and say, hey, do you want to sell that Volkswagen? He's like, well, it's not mine. I got married. I moved out. We were having kids. He's like, it's not mine. Leave me your number. I'll ask my son. I'm like, no, I don't want to sell it. In 2007, 2008-ish, I'm like, you know what? I want to restore it. We were talking about it. I'm like, Dad, I want to get the car on the road. It's going to be 50 years old in 2010. I'd like to have it on the road for that. And he kind of talked me into, he's like, well, we could take care of it. I'm like, well, we could get the engine taken care of and the transaxle, the transmission. I'm like, well, it's only whatever it is, 17 or 18 body bolts. I'm like, well, I've been thinking. He's like, you want to get rid of it, don't you? I'm like, well, no, I kind of want to take it apart and do a full restoration on it. And he's like, okay. So I actually took classes at the like a adult education, continuing education classes down at the Votech in Jackson. And I was going to figure out, do it all, not the transmission, but I was going to try and, figure it out and do the body work and all that. And started doing that. And then I had a really, I sent the transmission out to Bronze Transaxles out in California. And all this time, it's funny, This entire time, I'm on the Samba, right? I'm trying to learn how to do my own body work. I want to do my own paint. I can use the Votech. I'm reading these posts by this guy named Spook about how to do body work and how he does paint. And, he's all active all over, doing all these posts. And I'm writing, taking notes and trying to figure this all out. And then at some point, I'm like, well, where is this guy? And I'm like, oh, damn, it's down in Alabama, a little bit out of the driving range. And sure enough, my company got bought. And in 2016, we ended up moving down here. So I've been keeping an eye on Spook and reading what he posts in the Samba for years. So it built up that trust. And I know this guy's not a flake. So then I started saving my pennies, take it as far as we can, and sure enough, you guys took it all the way. But it had just such sentimental value. I'm like, I want to keep this stock. The way she drove it, it's the way I remember when I got it from her, and that's what we decided to do. We took it to its first car show on Saturday. There, at the end of the day, there were probably like 100 plus cars. The show's ends, the show's over, spectators go, they get, you guys gather around in a half circle, and they're like, okay, we're going to top 20 cars, awards. These are in no particular order. I'm just going to read them out. First one, he's like, okay, Steve Hersker, 1960 Volkswagen Beetle. We didn't get it to win awards. It's a sentimental value. We're handing it down to the kids. But my dad loved convertibles. Like, he had an Austin Healey when I was younger. He sold it and all that. But when he retired, he bought a Miata convertible. And then it was impractical, so he gave it to my wife, and we have that up in the garage. And we don't drive it that often. I'm like, we could sell the Miata and get a Gia. That way we'd have a VW to give to both of the boys. So we're actually considering doing that. But my youngest is really into it. My oldest is Jacob. He's, he likes it. He thinks it's cool. But my youngest was out there. I have pictures of them when he was 4, Ryan. He's 19, my youngest. Pictures of them, both of them out there with me. Working on the car. They're like scrubbing off the wheels and mechanically stripped down the chassis in Porsche 15. I got pictures of them walking around. I have this one picture of Ryan in the garage with an old paintbrush because we're putting Porsche 15, and he's holding a cordless phone talking to Becky, talking to my wife back home because we're working on it at my parents' house. And it just, I want to put a caption on it. If those parts aren't here by the end of the week. So I had designed those 2 boards and never did anything with them. Thursday night, went to Staples, uploaded them, printed them out Friday, ran and grabbed it. We pasted them to poster boards and put up signs on there. I couldn't believe it. I gotta tell you, I borderline cried. The number of people that came up, tell me their stories and hear my stories. And, like there was these beautiful 57 Chevys, but not everybody had a 57 Chevy. Not everybody had a Camaro. Right. Or, a 1958 Willis. Everybody has a Volkswagen Beetle story. It was so funny. So we got it home, and, that was September 2nd. But we test drove it around the block. And, I was all excited, and Darren's like, well, take it for a ride around the block. And I'm like, okay. And I'm like, I pulled the truck in and looped around with the trailer. I put it in neutral, and I take my foot off the clutch, and it stalls. It jumps forward and stalls. I'm like, all right, well, that's not good. Whatever. Run in, grab my glasses, hop back in. It's me and the boys. We go take it off. I'm having a hard time. It's not going well. When I'm going from second to third, I'm losing so much speed. I'm too slow for third. It wasn't going to be a speed demon, but it was just moving. I look in the mirror. There's smoke coming out of the back of it. I'm like, oh, God, this is a disaster. I pull back in, and Darren and the guys see smoke coming out of the back, and they're like, well, could just be paint burning off. And they look underneath, and they're like, do you have the parking brake on by any chance? I'm like, oh, look at that, I did. So that's over. We get it home. We get it off the trailer. And like an idiot, we live on a slight slant. I should have parked going up the hill. I parked going down the hill. Made it harder to get it off. It almost scraped the tailpipes. Whatever, we get it off. I'm like, hey, let's go for a ride around the block. Ricky, hop in, let's go for a ride. We get about 2/3 of the way, and it dies. Well, Steve, did you put gas in it? So let me get this straight. So far, you've had this for about 4 hours. Mile with the e-brake on, and then you ran out of gas. My Lanta. Yeah, so it was funny. And then we tried to color match the original color. Stock interior color with the gray seats and all that. And I had saved the radio block-off plate, right, to use to color match it. But it was in storage. Never got it. And then Darren was trying to match the color, and I couldn't find the radio block-off plates because that was my point. Because my aunt had it repainted. Darren's like, hey, it's time for paint. I'm like, okay, well, go with L451. I'm like, just see if you can match off the formula of it. Sure enough, not this past weekend, the weekend before, we have our basement's finished, but we have one room in the back corner that's unfinished, and it's a storeroom. And it was a mess. You could barely walk in it. And we were like, well, we're going through all this crap. We're going through it. We're opening every box. It's either going to trash, going to Goodwill, or we'll put it back in there, but we're going through everything. Wouldn't you know it, I found the stupid radio block-off plate in a random box. When I picked it up, I think Darren thought I was unhappy or something. I was just speechless. He's like, are you okay with this? I'm like, dude, I can't. It's gorgeous, I spent this money on a restoration. It was the sentimental value of having it back because it sat for 1987 to 2022. I've been with my wife. We got married in, I've known her since 92, married in 96. And then it was in our garage for years. But it was so funny, not funny, it was awesome. When we first came to Airkooled to see it after it had been painted, after Spook painted it, I turned around, looked at her, I'm like, are you crying? And she's like, no. I'm considering putting in my will that the car has to stay in the family for some number of generations.